Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. I'm Saladin Ambar. This episode was recorded on November 28th, 2023. Today, we have a conversation with Kelly Dittmar, an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University, Camden, and director of research and scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. We'll be discussing the center's latest report, Rethinking Women's Political Power, and exploring what its findings suggest about the future of women's representation in democracy. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, I know you and CAWP have produced many of these reports over the years. Could you just share with us a little bit about how this report on power differs from some of the work you all have done before?
Yeah, sure. So the Center for American Women in Politics, as you noted, has a history of doing research that's trying to understand where women stand in terms of women's political representation, and what could be done to both increase that representation and also why we care about this. In other words, why it matters. So a lot of work done on the impact of women in office. And that was our last real large scale research project before kind of these recent batch of projects that we've been doing on two areas, money in politics and this project on power. When we started to think about this project, which has been in the works for over 2 years, it's a very large scale, largely qualitative project. What we wanted to do was dig a little deeper and reframe a discussion that we've been having at CAWP for over 50 years, which was CAWP is known for keeping the numbers, i.e., how many women are at each level of office, by party, by race, et cetera. And in a lot of our conversations with outsiders, practitioners, advocates, representation or the number of women serving in office often becomes the code or proxy for power. In other words, if women are close to 50%, we must be doing great. But we knew, especially as women have gotten closer to 50%, that simply having that number of women in office doesn't equate to power. And so we wanted to investigate that more specifically and also illuminate it through the words and experiences of women themselves, elected women, activists, practitioners who could talk to us about, one, where does political power really lie? It's not only in elected office. And then how well are women represented in those positions? And then what are the dynamics of power once you're in office? So we talked about things like the importance of having leadership, the challenge of being in a partisan minority. And we did this by looking specifically in 5 states. And so we thought if we could just dig into political ecosystems within states, we could both identify those sites for power and really talk to primarily women, but also some men about how women are accessing that power and the degrees to which there are still barriers to it, as well as the ways in which women have seen gains in that power over the last decade.
That's really interesting. And I was struck by the selection of states and their sort of representativeness of the country. Maybe we can get into a little bit of that in a moment. But back to this question of power. Could you succinctly put to us how you are defining power in this report? What does it mean to say women have more or less power than before?
So we start the report. The report's made up of kind of 5 chapters. I don't want to make folks think it's too ominous. It's pretty accessible, but we start with a chapter that is defined as rethinking political power generally. And to sort of dodge your question, we have our interview subjects define power for us. In other words, we ask them all, what does power mean to you? What does political power mean to you? Right. And so we have a long listing at the beginning of this report of all of the ways in which they define power. And of course, the ways in which they align. So key things were the ability to make things move. In other words, when we're talking about politics, the ability to make policy move. And some define power simply as having a seat and a voice at decision-making tables. And that mattered to us a lot and informed our kind of framing of this issue when we were thinking about those who sit at the table who aren't elected. So I think those were among the key definitions or criteria for power that I think we landed on. And I think also in there are discussions about specific types of specific items that folks can use to leverage power. So votes, ability to knock on doors, money. And so the kind of currency of power, I think, came up as well in those definitions. So there's no one definition we put out, but I think you can see very quickly in the report the various criteria that we use to frame the remainder of the chapters.
Wow. I think obviously as political scientists, we've read lots of these types of reports that deal with representation and representativeness. I don't think I've ever read one with the subject of power at the center, which is really novel and I think critical to thinking about these issues. What kinds of structural barriers exist in these states and perhaps writ large for women being able to achieve the kind of power that men, frankly, have had, since time immemorial in our polity? What are the ingredients that have been missing or the impediments to women attaining power?
Yeah, we focus a full chapter on this, and it's really hard to distinguish, by the way, as you know, between kind of what is structural, what is political, what is a social barrier. But certainly among those that seem the most structural, or the perhaps easiest, I shouldn't say easy, the perhaps most directly changed by rules or formal procedures. The things that came up there were money, right? So money in various aspects. It was important for us in this report because my colleague Kira Matsu has been doing great research on women as donors or gender differences among donors, gender differences in campaign fundraising. And this continually comes up as well in qualitative research where legislators, candidates, women candidates will say, look, it's hard for us to raise money. But we know at the end of the day, they do, right? And so it's a tricky dynamic. But so certainly that came up in our report. Challenges around raising money, access to moneyed networks, particularly at intersections of race and gender, talking about historically marginalized groups who may have less access to these networks. But money also in terms of once you're in office. So legislator pay. And not only legislator pay, but if you're on, for example, we cite in our report, the Norman City Council. Okay. You're on the Norman City Council, you make $100 a month.
Now, right? Is this Norman, Oklahoma? What?
Norman, Oklahoma, yes.
All right, sorry. For our listeners out there who are a little Jersey-centric, we're at Norman, Oklahoma. Great, gotcha.
Yes. And if you're in the Oklahoma legislature, you make $47,500 a year. So even though a legislator is seen as perhaps more prestigious, you have to travel to the state capitol. These are relatively low amounts of money for folks to take on what is the difficult job of being in public service. And then add to that, if you're a staffer. So again, when we're thinking about power, thinking about broad definitions and sites of power, we know that political staff are highly influential. But they are almost universally underpaid. And so does that then not attract women? Does it challenge the dynamics of power? Those who can afford to take the opportunity cost of public service, decide to serve in that capacity. So money at various junctures. And there's disparities for women, again, because we know, generally speaking, women are coming into this with less wealth and less access to capital. And then add to that work family issues that come up all the time. When we talk about gender, this is changing because the dynamics of who takes care of children and who cares for the elderly, et cetera, is changing. But certainly it's still disproportionately women. And so the women we interviewed talked about the lack of childcare at whatever governmental body or institution they were a part of, or the lack of being able to use funds for childcare. This is changing in some states when you're on the campaign trail. But what if you're a staffer, right? That only applies to candidates. So work-family challenges are structural. And then, when we kind of bridge between the structure and social, of course, that's when we get into the more cultural dynamics of these institutions that have been dominantly white, dominantly male for all of history. And simply getting women in these institutions doesn't mean that those cultures go away overnight.
Right. Wow. Well, that's a lot to digest, and I think very important in thinking about the variations there. And did you get a sense of how voters respond to women in leadership positions, particularly as it applies to maybe racially or ethnically diverse women, people from these marginalized backgrounds historically? Is there any sense of the connection, or maybe the lack of a connection, between women of color in those power positions and voters?
Yeah. So again, we were coming at it. So just to give a quick background on who we interviewed. So
Sure.
We were interviewing, we identified largely women in positions of political power, right? So they were not only elected, but elected women, appointed women, women political practitioners like consultants, staffers, et cetera, lobbyists, activists and advocates, women's organization leaders, because we were particularly interested in women's political organizations and the way in which they shape these ecosystems, party leaders. So that was our group, our kind of population of interview subjects. And we did nearly 200 interviews, but across 5 different states. And so we weren't talking to the average voter, but we could garner, to your question, we could garner some sense of this from the women themselves and their experiences, or like if there was a practitioner, their sense of what voters thought of the increase in diversity in terms of political power. And so this is where you see a lot of variance, right? Because states matter and culture matters and party matters and diversity, racial and ethnic diversity of those states matter. So for example, representative from Pennsylvania, Emily Kincaid, she has a quote in our report where she says, look, when I was running, I would go to people's doors and they were just so grateful that it was a woman. In other words, like she said, I know historically this has been a challenge and people question women's qualifications and don't take them seriously and all of that. She's like, but for me, she was running in that 2018, 2020 era, right? In this moment. And she was like, they were just glad I was there. And they really thought that me being a woman was an advantage. And so you see some of that in this particular period where some women are saying it really was beneficial to me. And other women, specifically women of color, saying even despite some voters and the racism and sexism they absolutely faced, that at the same time they had experiences with voters who shared their identities that made them feel like this was worthwhile. So Jessica Garvin, who's a Latino legislator in Oklahoma, said, I was in the state legislature walking through the halls, a Latina young woman came up to me, right? And the sense that like somebody like me could be in this position of power, especially in a state of like Oklahoma, which is very dominantly white, right? And so you don't see that level of representation. So I think we heard kind of the both ends of these stories, which is the real value and importance of having of voters, particularly of these shared backgrounds and identities, seeing people like them in office, and that being quite motivating for the women. And at the same point, those same women saying, but man, there are other people and other issues that we still deal with, questioning our qualifications, even making us feel unsafe, right? Because of historical and contemporary racism and misogyny.
Well, this kind of qualitative research is so wonderful, and I think so much needed. These interviews are really, sociological, almost anthropological gold mines for thinking about women and not only politics, but as you and the report suggests, power. It's really fascinating. I'd love to see those. Are those interviews available anywhere, or?
So I will say, so the report itself and the microsite that we put out has over 600 kind of individual quotations from those interviews, and they're all searchable. and filterable by different dynamics, the state they're from, the topic, the role that they play, the party, race and ethnicity, all of these things. So there are ways to get at that interview data. We haven't put out full interview transcripts, and we don't intend to do that at this point. That wasn't something we asked for permission to do with our interview subjects. But I do intend to write a book-length project about this where I can integrate more of those stories, especially those longer stories of individual women or states. And so hopefully that'll be coming out. Well, we know time for books takes longer, but I'll be writing that into 2024.
Absolutely. Well, another related question as we begin to wind down is the question of partisan differences, either among the voters or the women themselves. Did you get a sense of their political trajectory, their rise into leadership positions, their rise into positions of power that varied based on political party? Did any of that come out in the report?
Absolutely. And this is something we've seen in the numbers over time, but what we could dig into qualitatively was what's behind those disparities. And the disparities are that women in office are disproportionately Democratic. And even in a Republican dominant state like Oklahoma, which is the state we studied, or Georgia, another state with strong Republican control, if you look at the percentage of those women who are in office, or women as a percentage of their party caucus, they are much better represented, in some cases over 50% in the Democratic Party, while they are usually less than 20% of Republicans in office. And so what we did in the report to kind of get at that was ask why. So why did these folks see this disparity? What explanations could they offer to us? And I think what we saw both through the way we probed them and we probed party leaders and the way they responded directly to that question was that Republicans were far less likely to define women's numeric underrepresentation as a problem in need of a solution. And it wasn't like they don't care about women's representation, but they very much don't agree, as you know, with this idea of quote unquote identity politics, that we have to get a certain percentage of a demographic group in office. And so we have these quotes where women are saying, well, I'm glad to have more women in office, but I don't think we should be doing targeted support, for women that is to the detriment of other groups. And so, to me, and we have a whole chapter on this in the report where we say, like, that's a huge problem. If we can't even just say this is a problem and need a solution and here are the ways we tackle it, it's going to make it very hard. And so we offer some suggestions in the report in terms of prescriptions to say, look, the infrastructure for women in politics today is very gender targeted. In other words, there are women's political PACs, women's political organizations. Republican women and men are largely not very generally across the board supportive of them. And the women who are struggle to get a lot of traction. And so we have to think about different ways to frame the problem to Republicans and maybe broader based solutions and infrastructure to support Republican women that isn't just framed as this is just for women, because that's a turnoff. And often the organizations that are targeting women, when we talk to Republican women, they repeatedly said to us, yeah, they say they're nonpartisan, but they're not for us. And so they also don't feel welcome in those spaces. So there's a support infrastructure and there's problem definition disparities by party that I think we can interrogate and intervene in, but we haven't really done so successfully. I say we as the women's political community thus far.
But by the way, before I get to my final question, where can faculty, students, ordinary citizens who are really interested in this topic of women in leadership and power, where can they find this report?
Yeah, so the report is on our website, and it's got a very easy URL in and of itself. So it's Rethinking Political Power, camden.rutgers.edu. But it'll also be on the main CAWP website, which is CAWP.rutgers.edu. And you can find there the report as well as other data and research on these topics. And then we'll also be pushing it out on our social media. So we're on X and Instagram, putting out some of the highlights and some of the direct quotes, including audio from this report. Those will be available and being circulated.
Well, Kelly, Dr. Dittmar, I've known you for a while and you've been at this for a while. Is there anything, despite your experience and your wealth of knowledge on this subject, is there anything from the report that surprised you?
I don't think there's anything that surprised me other than I think perhaps the value I saw after kind of digging in reframing this conversation. In other words, I had been so accustomed. Look, I work at the Center for American Women in Politics. We are known for keeping the numbers. So I'm so accustomed to using those numbers as the proxy, again, for power, as I said at the start. Once you open up the window, right, and you say, or if you think of those memes, right, where the flashlight's only in one part of the room, but you look in the shadows, I think you do find so much more. And what was really rewarding was when I would raise this to the women themselves, they would start thinking and kind of reframing their own thinking about power when I asked the question in that way. And so while it wasn't necessarily surprising that we saw some of the same barriers, some of the same challenges across the board for women, and by party and by race and ethnicity, I think what was really enlightening and helps us get to better prescriptions for action is thinking more broadly and more expansively about how we define and tackle the problem of gender disparities, in racial disparities, in political power, instead of solely in political representation. And so I hope that what the report does is both kind of change the way we talk about this and also give us some new sights for action.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think this is a really intriguing and much needed digging behind and beneath under the numbers, which is great. Those numbers do tell a story, but I think what you're getting at here in this report is something significantly different, and I think hopefully will lead to further improvement and examination from citizens as well as scholars like yourself and others who value the role and position of women in American politics. So thank you so much for this and for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean.
Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click in the links in the description. Please help support the work we do at This Moment in Democracy. Visit our podcast page at eagleton.rutgers.edu to learn more. We want to hear from our listeners. Email us at podcast@eagleton.rutgers.edu to send in your comments about today's episode or suggest topics that you want to hear about.